Hey everybody, how we doing? Happy December. Welcome to the Designed to Influence podcast, where we talk about the modern man as we go through Tony Dungy's book Uncommon. Chapter 3 today on humility and stewardship. But before we get into that, gotta say hello to my pop, Mr. Dave Dyrud. How we doing, Dad?
I'm doing well. Excited to be here. This is a fun topic. Well, maybe not fun, but a good topic to have conversation about.
It's a fun topic. It's a hard topic for many, but I think it's fun.
Yeah.
To get into all these are fun, and we'll break it down as best we can. But yeah, how's everything out in beautiful Colorado in this December? You guys is it full Christmas swing out there now?
Pretty much everyone, at least in our area, has shifted over to the Christmas lights. And I'll give one shout out because you know this person, but do you remember Walt and Karen Hazard?
Yep.
They have been decorating their house like a gingerbread house every year, and they're just a mile away from our house. This year, they were on a nationwide TV show, kind of like Extreme Makeover type thing, but for Christmas lights.
Yeah.
So their house was highlighted all over the country because of their beautiful decorations. So
haven't they been on a show before, or have they just been on the news? And this is the first time
they've been on the news multiple times. This time, and I think it happened last year where they were announcing that they were going to be on the show, but they were on the show. It was on just a couple days ago, so Mom and I watched it, and it got us more in the Christmas mood.
Nice. What service is it on? Do you remember?
Oh, it was like ABC or NBC or
okay.
Primetime
channel.
Network primetime show on Sunday evening. So
okay, very cool. Well,
we'll be out
there. Yeah, we'll be out there soon. We see it every year, so that'll be cool.
Yeah.
I'm always impressed. LA out here, we don't have the Christmas weather necessarily, but there is a ton of Christmas events. Just our city of Pasadena just last weekend had a huge Christmas festival right by our house down Lake Street, and with Santa, and they had horse-drawn carriages, and so I'm always impressed that they do a lot out here, actually, even without the snow and chill. But we definitely get the Christmas stuff. So hope everyone's preparing, having fun, remembering the reason for the season. But it is always my favorite time of year, and I think we're already 30 Christmas movies in on this day of December 5th. So we started early, and we've got obviously the Christmas sheets on, the trees in multiple places of our small apartment. So always fun to do that, and excited to celebrate with you guys here in a couple weeks. But today's topic.
I think we're with you on the 30 plus movies already.
Yeah, usually all of November we'll hit all the newer ones. So we'll hit all the new Hallmark ones that come out, or any ones on Netflix. They always have a few that come out. And then once we get around this time, December 5th and beyond, then we start the classics that we haven't, the Love Actually, The Holiday. I never watch Elf till Christmas Day, but we'll get into the ones we've seen now. But anyway, Tony Dungy's book, Uncommon. We're going through it. Chapter 3, Humility and Stewardship. Pop, as we do, can you just give a kind of brief overview? This was a much longer chapter than last week's.
Yeah.
Obviously, all of these are important topics, but I think a little more in depth when it comes to humility and stewardship and what those mean. So if you can just give a brief overview of what the chapter was about, that'd be great.
Yeah. When I first saw the heading of the chapter, I was a little confused because humility and stewardship don't always seem to be the similar topic to talk about. But I love the way Tony describes it. Without humility, we will not really understand or practice the idea of stewardship. So he connects the two together. One of my favorite quotes, and I think I've quoted her before, even on this very new podcast, but Mother Teresa has one of my favorite quotes on the topic of humility. She says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. So we're putting others in the focus, putting others in the forefront. And when we really understand the concept of putting others first, and God would be ultimately first and then other people, that helps us with the idea of stewardship, because stewardship in general is the concept in the Bible that is God owns everything, and we are his stewards or managers of the resources. So they're not ours to do with what we want. They're God's, and he has entrusted it to us to use for his kingdom, for his glory, and for the flourishing of others. So humility and stewardship really do tie together well.
Yeah, yeah, and a tough one to do, especially, in this book, obviously it ties it a lot to sports, and in my world, covering sports, it's fitting. But it's humility is an interesting one with sports because you're taught that, especially if you play team, or specifically if you play team sports, that you have to have humility. It's about the team, not yourself. But then a lot of the stars are, it's single proclamation of who those stars are, and some of them play into that. Look at me. Some of them don't and shy away from it, but they're just given that kind of threshold from that. So it's always interesting talking about these in terms of athletes because it is a very defining characteristic. But yeah, let's get into maybe some quotes you liked, unless you had something else to add. But what was one that you wanted to start with in this? Lot to choose from.
Yeah, well, you kind of alluded to it already in the comments you were just making, but I hadn't thought about it from this perspective before. But when Tony is talking about sports, specifically athletes who are coming into the NFL, because that was um, his experience in the sporting world, and how he's I forget exactly how he said it, but he said it's not always out of arrogance that people are um, kind of moving towards the look at me attitude, but it's a survival. And I thought that was kind of interesting. It's like in the NFL, you have a very short career oftentimes, and there's really, really strong competition. There are a lot of people who can do the same things in very similar ways, and you make the team by standing out. So he talked about how at least within sports and the younger generations. He said it wasn't that way when he played, but as he was coaching, he was noticing the trend where players were feeling this burden and responsibility to make sure everyone noticed them so that they could make the team. And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it because I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it definitely is, and I think it's definitely true in terms of a lot of athletes. And when you look at the great ones, I think you look at who has humility and maybe who didn't. If you remember the player more for their personality and who they were versus their play on the field, then that probably is telling. Not necessarily that that's a bad
Yeah,
thing, not tearing
yeah.
them down, but if you remember a player for just strictly, man, that player was really, really good, but you don't remember much of them off the field, and that kind of thing. I think of like Terrell Owens, for instance. He's arguably the greatest, if not a top three receiver of all time, but he's probably more remembered for his personality and his maybe lack of humility, for better word.
Exactly. And sticking with a similar name, the Terrells, I was thinking of Terrell Davis on the opposite side when
Yeah,
you were talking, because um, he was in his rookie training camp unnoticed by the team. And I remember him saying in one interview that they were going for their final, maybe it was the third preseason game of the season. They were going to Japan, they were going to play there. And based on how the practice and stuff had gone leading up to the game, he realized, I'm not going to get on the field. I probably won't play at all. So he was starting to make plans to go home. And it's
mm-hmm.
like, I'm going to get cut, not going to be on the team. And I thought it was kind of funny. He talked about how he'd eaten a whole bunch of hot dogs because he wasn't going to play anyway. And all of a sudden, one of the coaches, maybe it was right after halftime, I can't remember the time of the game, but they said, we need to put this guy in, just see what he does. It was a kickoff, and he flies down and makes one of the best tackles I've ever seen on a kickoff coverage part of the game. And he was immediately noticed, and
Yep.
then he was put into the lineup as a running back to see what he could do. And very shortly after that, he became the starting running back of the Broncos. And when I think of Terrell Davis, I think of his play on the field. I
Mm-hmm.
know very little about him off the field, but his play was pretty remarkable. So that's kind of the opposite of the Terrell Owens that you were talking about.
Yeah. and the great Terrell Davis, obviously my favorite player growing up.
Yeah.
Um, so one quote that because I think the confusing part for many, including myself, sometimes is what's the difference between um, humility, or I guess when you break down the opposite of humility would be pride, I guess. And what's the difference between pride and confidence? Because it's, you
Hmm.
have to be not just in sports, but in life, you need to have some confidence in order to be
Yeah.
successful, and belief. But how do you separate that from pride? Because we know all that pride is the fall of man. There's so many proverbs about, not being too prideful and whatnot. And so this in the early part of the chapter, pride is all about me, but confidence is a realization that God has given me abilities and created me to fill a unique role that no one else is called to fill. Born in humility, confidence is a recognition that life is not about me, but about using the gifts and abilities I have been blessed with to their fullest. And it's not just using the gifts to benefit me, but to help my team and impact others. So, I mean, that might be the quote of the whole chapter, in my opinion, because that I think breaks it down perfectly, the difference between pride
Yeah.
and confidence. Because you have to have confidence, but it's confidence in your ability based on what you were given by God, and then using that ability to benefit all of those around you, not just your own personal gain, which pride seems to be more of just in the you category.
Absolutely. And a story that I think of from the Bible related to this would be David before he was king, and he's going up against Goliath. One of the things in that story that always stands out to me is David wasn't challenging Goliath, who is the giant of a man. He was the hero of the enemy. He was a warrior, and it says in the text he was a warrior longer than David had been alive. And David was a smaller man, but when when David saw his nation cowering at the threats of this um, just terrifying man named Goliath, what David had confidence in was not necessarily in himself, but confidence in the God he served and that God wanted to take care of his people. So he went out on behalf of the nation of Israel, knowing that God was with him, and God wanted him um, to represent the nation of Israel well. And I've always thought about that. He didn't have the physical ability to go toe to toe with Goliath, but he had confidence in who God was and that God was using him in this situation.
Yeah, that's a whole nother level of confidence. That's a definite God-given confidence as well that it's tough to come by. So, what's the next quote that you liked in this one?
I was looking at just right below there where humility is not false modesty. And I think that's just a short little statement, but I think that's true. Oftentimes, you'll meet someone or come across someone, and sometimes I've even done it myself, where I'm coming across humble, but really, um, I am prideful in what I'm doing, or another person might be prideful, but they're just kind of by peer pressure or by um, political correctness or whatever you want to say, they come across and can appear humble, but in their underlying attitude, they're not. And I think that's an important distinction
Hmm.
because if it's a false modesty, eventually the pride will be visible.
Yeah,
If it's a genuine humility, it's going to stay as humility.
yeah, yeah. This is one that I don't want to say I struggle with. I definitely don't like being the center of attention. I like to kind of go under the radar, but there is an aspect for me personally, and I know you know about this book, the love language book, the 6 love languages or whatever it is.
The
Many
five
out there,
love language.
5 love languages, and many out there probably do. And my love language is words of affection. Like sometimes I just need that affirmation, and so that can definitely blend with uh whatever, like modest humility or hidden hidden humility, I guess. So it's hard to kind of separate those in a way. And I think there's a very healthy way of that too. It's not just saying like, oh, you don't deserve praise ever. Obviously, that's not the case, but it's blending those two together of being human, being humble and having humility, but then also correctly, I guess, seeking affirmation. So, I mean, what do you think about that? That is kind of a different blur.
It is, and a story that I was thinking about as I was reading this chapter. I heard it a number of years ago, and I've tried to find the names that go to this, and I haven't been able to. So you'll just have to hear the content of the story. But Margaret Thatcher, who was the Minister of England,
Mm-hmm.
she had two men who were part of her cabinet, and they worked very closely together. They were men who were highly respected globally for who they were and what they did, and the experts that they were in their fields. So she was asked one time what the differences were between the two gentlemen. And she said, when I'm in the presence of this person, I feel like I'm in the presence of the greatest man in the world. And then she pointed to the other person. When I'm in the presence of this person, I feel like I'm the greatest person in the world. And the point that she was making is that the one gentleman was very gifted, very good at what he did, very highly respected. But when you were with him, he put himself at the center of the focus. When you were with the other one, he was just as good at what he did, just as highly respected, just as accomplished. And yet, when you were with him, he made you feel important. And I think that's a healthy distinction because it reveals what's in our heart. False modesty or false humility, eventually what's in our heart is going to come out.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's a true humility, we don't need to promote ourselves. We actually love to lift others up and support others when we're living in that posture. And we get to be part of helping others stand out rather than ourselves. And the proverb that was early in the chapter, Proverb 27, I think, verse 2, it says, don't promote yourself, but let others speak on your behalf. And I think that happens more so when you're in the situation where you're not always being the one talking about yourself, but you're letting others do that because you're lifting other people up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just watched the Polar Express, which Mia loved. I was so happy that she loved that she's getting into Christmas movies. But there's that boy that has no humility, and Santa tells him you need to be humble and learn humility and and not talk about yourself so much. So um, fitting there, and right after that, just tying it back to the book, Tony Dungy told this story, and it's such a simple story, but at the time he was the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and his I think it was his brother-in-law. I can't remember exactly, but someone in his family member came down to visit. And at the hotel, the brother-in-law was down hanging out with some of the team, and Tony Dungy was already back up in the room to go to sleep. And when he came back up, he went to go sleep on the couch, and Tony Dungy was already on the couch and had given him the bed. And it was just one of those moments of saying, like, no, you're my guest. And the brother-in-law was like, you're the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Like, you deserve the bed. And basically Tony was saying, like, that's not how this works. Like, you're my guest. So anyway, just such a simple story of putting others before yourself and being humble and not saying like I deserve this because I'm more powerful than you or have a better job than you or this or that. And then that speaks for itself. And that in turn then reflects back to you on your humility.
Exactly. And along those lines, he also mentions men like Tom Landry, who
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't even mention his job as head coach of the Dallas Cowboys until you really pressed him on it in a conversation. He talked about Billy Graham in much of the same way, where Billy Graham sat at the table with some of the most famous dignitaries of his day globally. And yet, I've heard stories about him when you meet him. He was so unassuming, so humble, so um, he would put the attention on other people, not himself. And yet, he'd been all over the world sitting with some of the most important people in the entire world. And yet, he just lived a humble life. and
Yep.
that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Um,
I always think of titles. Like some people love titles and you went through school a long time. I get it, you deserve it. I've always will definitely call like for instance working in sports whenever I meet a coach until I know them on a personal level, I call them coach. They've earned that title, it's respect. But I do know people that demand that, like, oh, I'm a doctor. You will call me doctor,
yes,
blah blah blah. And I always think of you like you never wanted anyone to call you pastor. Obviously, if people did it, you didn't like say don't call me pastor, but it was just Dave. And I think that's just a small thing too, where you can notice it. Like, oh, people love those titles. I don't think that's really the
yes.
important thing, and that's what this chapter is going into.
Yeah, you remind me of a guy that we hired years ago to work at the church. He was a part-time hire, so he only worked like 15 hours a week. And he um, lectured me one time because I was introducing him from the pulpit and I didn't call him Reverend. So
Yeah,
he got offended by that. And to your point, I just went by Dave, and here's this assistant who was a new hire, and he wanted to be called Reverend.
yeah. So the titles mean they're silly. They mean nothing. But I mean, I will do it out of respect. But I just find it funny when people demand that because that's a very tall sign of lack of humility, I think. um, let's move on to the second part of the chapter of stewardship, and we can give some quotes with that. But if you can, I know you gave a brief overview of the chapter, but I mean, I think stewardship is one that maybe is less understood by people. So, just what is stewardship to you, and what it means for the modern man?
Yeah, stewardship is a term that was used much more back in the medieval days and before that. So in our culture, we're not as familiar with it. We would probably use a word like manager, caregiver, something like that in modern culture. But what a steward was is you had like a wealthy landowner who had a large estate, and they didn't manage their estates very often. They would hire someone called a steward, and that steward would work on behalf of the owner to manage the estate and make sure that the estate was continuing to grow and be healthy. So the steward had the authority to do anything they thought was right on behalf of the owner. So they could act on the owner's behalf. They could sign legal documents on the owner's behalf. They could do anything on behalf of the estate owner because they were given that authority, yet they didn't own anything themselves. Everything they did was to increase the value of the estate and the expansion of the estate on behalf of the master. So when we think of a biblical idea of stewardship, what we're talking about is that it's the understanding that God is the owner of everything and I am simply the manager of it. And my role is to use the gifts that he's given me in order to continue to grow and expand the kingdom which belongs to God. So my finances are not mine to use however I want. I steward them so that God's kingdom benefits. My time, same thing. The specialized giftings or skill sets that I have, it's always those are being used not for my personal gain, but for the benefit of God's kingdom and for the flourishing of others.
Yeah, yeah, and I think when we apply this to kind of everyday life, we can go into quotes, but I'd love to hear like an example. But I one that I think of, like, how are we working and being a steward for God, but also for our coworkers or family or whatever it may be. And I think back to my time in the restaurant industry. I was a GM, general manager for a restaurant, and I think a lot of people. And I don't want to sound like I'm coming down on people, but a lot of people when they get into management roles, they forget the word manager or steward in this case, and basically just are the boss and give out directions and let everyone else do that. But in my idea of a true manager is you're uplifting those around you to make their job easier, and then
Mm-hmm.
you're just also helping manage time and whatnot. So I saw myself. as a manager, I was just a busboy with the key to the building. They had a little more power to delete items and correct things if they were wrong. But in reality, I was a busboy that needed to do everyone else's job to help them do their job better. And so that's how I viewed myself, to look up or to lift up my coworkers. And I think good managers, good coaches, good whatever profession you're in, that's how you can be a steward, is leading by doing basically what everyone else is doing, not just sitting up on your hierarchy, riffing off ideals and then letting everyone else do them.
Exactly. The longtime leadership guru, John Maxwell, used to say, and he probably still does say, I guess, he would talk about leadership and he would say it's not um, about privilege, it's about responsibility. So when I become a leader, or in this case, steward or manager, it doesn't mean that I have extra privileges. What it means is that I now have more responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that connects with what you were saying. You are taking responsibility for the staff of the restaurant and for the health of the restaurant. So you were taking on roles that were important, so that the whole organization would flourish. And oftentimes in our culture, we think, oh, I've arrived, I've succeeded, I'm now the CEO or top executive or whatever the title is. Now I get to sit back and people get to wait on me.
Yeah.
I get to be in that privileged position. And it's a very different thing when you look at the biblical concept of leadership versus, and I wouldn't even call it man's view. I would call it maybe the negative side of man's view of leadership. Because I
Yeah.
do think there's a lot of people who demonstrate really good leadership who would not call themselves Christians, but they lead well anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And just another example, and how it pertains to you and, what I saw growing up. And, um, for the 20 years you and mom led the church, all the way till the end, you guys did set up and tear down. And at the very end, there was, I think, more of I was obviously moved out here, but there was more of a schedule where people took certain weeks, but you still were on that schedule. And I remember growing up, people saying, like, what are you doing? You're the pastor. You should not be doing this. Like, you don't have time for this. Same to mom too. Mom, to her credit, always did it. And you're the pastor's wife. Like, you guys can't be doing this. And you always use that as a, no, this is how we serve the church. And this is our, purpose to do everything. And when you see those leaders that, some people call it, and it can be overbearing if you're micromanaging. Obviously, that's a whole different topic. But I think that in some instances, it's important as a leader to have your hand in every aspect of the business, of the church, of the team, not to micromanage, but to be able to put yourself in every situation and in those shoes, and carry them out. And then all the people can see, like, wow, look at how this person leads, because they do what I do. They don't just sit above me and do this. And so I think you tearing down and breaking down the church every single week was just such a simple example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a acronym that's used in the realm of coaching, not necessarily sports related coaching, but just coaching in general. And it's the acronym MALL, and it stands for model, assist, watch, and launch. And if we're not modeling something that we want someone else to learn, but we're just telling them or instructing them, but we're not modeling it, we don't always carry the credibility down the road that would um, maybe foster a team that really does what we're talking about, not just doing it when things are visible, but doing it because they own it in their heart, because they're seeing the people above them modeling it as well.
Yeah. And speaking of modeling, I'll read this quote from later in the chapter. But the idea of being a role model, of giving back to the community where you grew up or where you live now, is not talked about much. It doesn't have to be money that you give back. It can be time, encouragement, or simply role modeling. Letting our young men know that they don't have to follow the crowd. They don't have to do the stereotypical things. I tell our players that being a good role model is one way we can be good stewards of the positions God has put us in. I also try to teach my sons the value of a dollar the way my dad taught me. So just a case in point of being that role model. And it can look very different in different situations. It doesn't have to necessarily be giving money, it can be giving time, can be just being an example of what it should be. And so I like that idea of that as well.
I do as well. And I was thinking about, because he starts by talking about money, and then he quickly moves into time and talents and stuff like that. And I think there's a distinction that's worth highlighting here. In the Bible, Jesus talks about money a lot, and the whole Bible as a one continuous book talks about the finances. And even though stewardship of our time is equally important in the idea of stewardship, I wonder if the reason that Jesus didn't spend so much time talking about money as it related to stewardship is that he understands that material things tend to captivate our heart. And if the possessions we have control our heart, it will also control how we use our time and how we use our talents and stuff like that. So money is like the starting point. And if God um, really is in the position of owning everything in our mindset, all of our finances, our possessions, then what it does is also frees us up in how we use our time, how we use our talents to honor God and to serve the people around us. So um, they're not all on the same level. I think it starts with finances and then moves into the others.
Yeah. And it's so hard, right? Like it's not an easy thing because anything we do, you need money, right? Like I
Yeah.
think most people out there, definitely I know me and you, like if we could be stewards and do what we love and do it for free, we would. It's not like I want to just have all this stuff, but you have to obviously have money to do that. So it's controlling that. Okay, I have to do this to earn to support, but then I also need to make sure that that's not my only driving goal. The goal is to get to here. I have to do this to get to there, but I don't want to lose focus on that and start saying, okay, well, this is kind of nice, earning more and getting more comfortable, and then you get away from what the purpose was to begin with, and that's a challenge I think for everyone. And like, how do you? We can kind of wrap up with this. Like, how do you? I don't want to say control that challenge, but really keep your eyes on the prize, for lack of better words, of what your purpose is.
Yeah, that's a hard one, and I think a little bit towards the beginning of the stewardship section of this chapter, Tony asks a series of questions, and the questions are: how much do you invest in the stock market? What kind of car have you recently purchased? What do you give to your church? What ministries or charities are you investing in? Things like that. He just asks a whole series of questions, and I think those questions are getting at um, a good mindset. And it's not that God is against us having things. I think it's more about, do they control us or do we control them?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big distinction. And I've heard people say, and I wish I could attribute who said them, but I've heard people say that you can be a wealthy person and be stingy, but you can also be a poor person and be stingy. You
Mm-hmm.
can be a person who lives in poverty but is generous, and you can be a wealthy person who is generous. So it's not the amount of things that we have that dictate whether we're a good steward or not. It's really, does it own our heart or does our heart own it? And that's a hard thing, but the way that we can check that, Tony says, if in the same quote that I read earlier, that we can look at our checkbook and oftentimes determine if our money's owning us or not by where
Mm-hmm.
we're investing our money. If we're just paying bills and stuff like that, we all have to do it. But where we spend our time and our money really determines what our focus is. And if we are, this might sound um, challenging to some, but one of the things that God speaks a lot about in Scripture is practicing generosity. And as we give of the resources that he's entrusted us to, somehow what it does in our hearts is it takes our hands off of the controlling factor of those possessions. If I learn to give of what I have, then I don't hoard it as much. But the least amount that I give, the more I hoard what I have. And studies have been done, and they've shown that to be the case. Money controls us more when we give less away. The more we give away, the more we're free to continue to give. And the beautiful thing in that is God says that if you live a generous lifestyle, I will make sure that you have all the resources you need to continue to be generous, because I want you to be generous.
Yeah. Yeah, and it can be so simple too, because sometimes there's that fear of, okay, if I give, I'm not going to have enough to get by. And so it's taking that leap, to people's credit, because once you do give, it just becomes second nature, and that's a part of your financial, and that's a whole probably a different chapter of finances, as we're getting kind of down this tangent a little bit, but it just becomes a part of it, and you almost, I don't want to downgrade it, but you almost forget about it if it becomes a second nature, because before you were fearful, you now don't have that. How are you going to make ends meet? Where now is like, okay, well, now I just use this to make ends meet, because I already have allocated that to give. And the last point I'll make, and I think the first step in, when it comes to financial stewardship, I think the first step in to take to get there is coming to the realization that you will never have enough
Yeah.
to satisfy.
Yeah.
I was of my friend group, I was pretty much the first one to get married and pretty much the first one to have a kid. And so whenever I talk to friends before, now they're all pretty much all married, but before they were married, but now getting ready to have kids, the first thing that everyone always says is, well, I want to be more stable in my job. I want to have a house first. I want to make more money so that there's more stability, this, and that. And I don't want to make this sound like being irresponsible, but what I always say is, like, once you meet that goal, that you're going to make yourself another goal. Like, you're never going to have enough to feel like you're stable enough for marriage or to have a kid in terms of finances and material things. If it's in your heart that you're ready and this is what you want, which is what stewardship should be, then you need to, the first step is realizing you're not ever going to get to that point of having enough or having those goals that will get you materially feeling like you're there. It's either it's in your heart and God's put it on you, or it's not. So I think that's the first step in stewardship, is realizing, like, why not now? Like, I'm good now. The rest will take care of itself if I'm doing this in the correct way. So I'll end it with that.
Yeah, that's very well said. When we get in the mindset of feeling like we don't have enough, we will never feel like we have enough, and we end up living with a mindset of scarcity. Whereas God teaches in Scripture a mindset of abundance, and it's not because we are creating it; it's because He is giving it, and that's a whole different way to live. But it can be a very freeing way to live. And Mom and I have seen over and over and over in our marriage, in our lives together, where we didn't think we were going to have what we needed, and yet God miraculously provided in ways that could only be explained that He stepped in and provided. And that has increased our confidence in Him and our trust in Him, so that the next time we're in a situation like that, rather than living out of fear or a mindset of scarcity, we can live in a mindset of confidence and trust that God will come through like He has in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, unless you have anything else to add, I think that will do it for this week's episode of the Design to Influence podcast. So thank you all for tuning in. We'll be on chapter 4 next week as we head into the holidays. And I think, Pop, we'll be able to do maybe one of these in person here in a couple weeks, which will be fun.
That will be fun. Sitting across the table.
Yeah, sit together.
Our next chapter's on courage, which is will be another fun one to talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Courage is a great one. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of great stories and ways to relate that. So this is the Design to Influence podcast. Thank you all. Everyone have a blessed week. Be well. And we'll talk to you all soon.